we had a nice friendship, and see, a good story to tell, whereas stories about Vicky are not that interesting. But so I'll tell you this story about.
Well, yeah, she must have been interesting enough to last for 12 years.
Oh yeah, no, she was a lovely person, and I can mention something about her shortly. But let me tell you this anecdote because I enjoy telling it. So Terry's parents lived in a split-level ranch in St. Paul, quite wealthy. He was a vice president at the 3M company, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, big time. So he was one of the vice presidents of the organization. And of course, because of my friendship with Terry, I got invited to go there for dinner on several occasions. And as happens with most Americans, they want to know when you're going to become a citizen of the United States. Of course, everybody would want to do that, wouldn't they? So I was asked by her stepfather, you know, are you thinking of becoming a citizen? Of course, being a diplomat, I said, oh, well, certainly. I said, but first of all, of course, I've got to get a green card, which will enable me to work here and so on. And then that means I have to get in a queue, and then when I get to the top, maybe I'll get it. And I said, I did apply for this green card, but I didn't get sufficiently high in this thing to get it yet. He said, oh, well, will you be trying again? I said, oh, yeah, I'll try again next year. He said, well, when you do, why don't you let me know? Give me a call, let me know you're applying, and I'll see if there's anything I can do to help you. So, you know, under other circumstances, I'd have thought, oh, yeah, you know, some big time. But above the mantelpiece in their home was a big photograph, which was about yay big.
Oh, wow.
And it showed Terry's father shaking hands with Hubert Humphrey. And in the background behind was the vice presidential seal of the United States. That's when Hubert, who was a senator from Minnesota, was vice president, you see. Now, the thing I haven't told you is that Terry's father's name was Lou B. Jewett. That was his full name. That's important to know that because in the corner of this big photograph, Hubert had written, to my old friend LBJ. So this was his little humour, you see. So LB Jewett could also be Lyndon Baines Johnson. So I thought, well, if he knows Hubert Humphrey well enough to have that photograph up above his mantelpiece, maybe it is worthwhile giving him a call. So I did call him a year later, and he got a few details from me and said, I think you'll be hearing from Senator Fraser, who was the senator for Minnesota at the time. And so I said, oh, thanks very much, Lou, that's great, you know. And so I waited, and sure enough, in the mail came a letter from Senator Fraser. It was full of poly talk, you know, we need bright young people in this country who can, you know, stand democracy, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And so I understand that you're interested in applying for a green card and so on. I think, you know, we can see what we can do about it. Whatever he said, I can't remember now. But anyway, I thought, oh, well, that's great. So apparently Lou's had some influence with the senator from Minnesota, and looks like something might happen. Sure enough, a few weeks later came my green card in the mail, and in the same mail came my call up for the army. So I thought, oh, you know, the army. So of course,
You haven't even been a citizen yet.
look, when you're an alien, when you're an alien in the United States at that time at least, you couldn't vote, you paid taxes, and you were eligible for the call up.
Really?
Yeah.
That's without the green card.
So much for being an alien. So anyway, of course, all my colleagues were also getting called up, and they had various ways of keeping out of the army. My friend Roland Griffith, for example, was studying physiological psychology, and he knew all about anxiety and blood pressure and so on. So he got it when it was his turn to go in and be, have his temperature taken and get all the details. He drove round and round the block that had the call-up centre in it, and he worked himself up into a rage about the whole thing. Of course, went in there, and he had high blood pressure. No, he couldn't. Sorry, you won't be able to serve, sir. Medical exemption. But I wasn't smart enough for all that, so I got signed up, you see. However, at the time, because the Vietnam War was creating such a hubbub, there was a group of young men who became known as the Minnesota Eight, who broke into the recruitment offices downtown, and with a mixture of blood and red paint poured it all over the files, which were all paper files in those days, of course.
Brother Berrigan's, are they involved in that?
No, but it's a similar thing.
Yeah.
So, then some 2 or 3 months later, I think it might have been, I got a letter from the army saying, due to circumstances beyond our control, we're not sure whether we have all your information accurate, and would you mind coming down to the recruitment centre so we can make sure we've got the right details? So I just ignored that letter, never heard another word, never got a draft card. So that was interesting. Yeah. So the Minnesota 8 saved me, and they eventually went to court, and I think the judge kind of dismissed the whole case eventually.
So I wonder why they didn't follow up.
They must have had my name somewhere and an address, but that's all, perhaps. So anyway, what happened then?
Lucky boy.
Yeah.
Well, Vicky, I met Vicky because I'll tell you all about it. The winters in Minnesota are a bit hard to take, particularly for somebody like me who's not been used to it. And one of the ways we graduate students tried to cope with things was we formed a thing called Pork Lovers Anonymous, and we had actually little cards printed which we could carry in our wallets, and had a picture of a little pig and the name of the president of the organisation, who was my friend Gary Sherman, who I still keep in touch with every week by email. And because we were actually housed in the Minnesota University Hospital, down in the bowels of the hospital were all the research labs and so on, and they often had pigs there that they were doing experiments with. And of course, when the pigs had done whatever it was with the experiment, they were sacrificed. And some of our friends were working in there, and they could actually take the pig. So we started to have big pig on the spit, right in the middle of winter in Minnehaha Park and places like that. This was all so we could stay sane in the winter time. And that's how we formed Pork Lovers Anonymous. So we had like 50 or 60 people who were
You
members.
weren't rescuing the pigs then?
No.
From their
Well,
terrible
No,
life?
no, they were going to be sacrificed anyway. We just ate them. So it was like,
Wait, why were they being sacrificed?
well, they could have been
Just
thrown out, I
experiment.
suppose, and
They might have
disposed
been
of.
full of drugs and all
Could have
sorts
been,
of
who knows?
experimental stuff.
I think Larry, who was our main person, our friend Larry, who was the main person who got these, I'm sure he must have been smart enough to know which ones were.
They were testing on the pigs and then they threw them out and you guys killed them and ate them.
That's right.
Oh,
So
It's called good for the environment.
anyway, it was
What is it?
in
I
the
don't know
context of the porkins, as we used to call them, that I met this young woman called Vicky, and that's how we became acquainted. And we got
And was she
married
from
in
Minnesota or was she
1972, I
from
think it was.
somewhere else? Is she from Minnesota or from
Yes, a
somewhere else?
Minnesota girl, born and bred. And when we finally had I decided I was coming back to Australia, and she didn't want to come back. She didn't want to leave Minnesota. She ended up as a nurse, and she ended up as the advisor to the State Minister for Health. So she was, you know, in the whole health thing, and had quite a responsible job there. And I still hear about it through Gary from time to time. He has.
You didn't have kids?
Hmm?
Did you have kids?
No.
No.
No, well, that's the other thing I can tell you. You know, by the time I'd gotten there, and by the time I met Vicky, I was already 34 or something like that. And I had been a bit resistive about the whole marriage thing for many years. But I got to the point where I'd said to myself, well, look, if I met somebody I was really caught up with, and that person was very keen to have children, I probably could manage. I'd probably be a reasonable father, I think, you know. So I'd kind of be softened to the point where I thought, yeah, you know, I'd go along with it. It turned out, when I got to know Vicky, that she was absolutely adamant she didn't want to have children.
Oh, right.
None. So it was agreed that I would have a vasectomy. And we had these friends, Pat and H.G. Bloom, whom I still keep in touch with. They're very prominent doctors now. They're doing lots of work overseas and so on in various African countries and things. And H.G. Bloom, his father was a prominent doctor there in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And it was arranged that I'd have the vasectomy with him. And Vicky, who was already a nurse at that time, came in and was wearing the mask while he was more or less telling him where to cut. You know, so she was quite sure that I'd had the vasectomy. So that's what happened about the children, your question. There's many things I could talk about, but you know, the day is getting on, and I don't.
So
want
you
to
came back to Australia when?
the end of '85. I left there on the 17th of August, I think it was, or September. I think it was the 17th of September, and did some travels to come back. I'll tell you one other little anecdote about my travels back. And some of you have heard this story before, while I was getting ready to leave, I knew I'd be going back to Australia for good, and I was going to make some travels on the way, including towards the end of my travels, a visit to China, and I'd signed up for an American tour. A bunch of American people were going to tour, and I was to be at the Hilton Hotel in Hong Kong by a certain date so I could join the tour. I was going to go on mainland China. But while I was getting ready for this, I was looking at the newspapers, and I came across this article by Jane Morse. I'm glad I can remember her name. If I forget it by the time I get the anecdote in mind, Jane Morse. And this was a syndicated column. She was a travel writer who had her column syndicated in many newspapers in the United States. And this particular article that she'd written was about the time that she had gone from Shanghai down to Hong Kong on this lovely old passenger ship that went down the South China Sea to Hong Kong. And she described it in great detail, how wonderful it was, old-fashioned woodwork and curtains and things, and all you could hear was the slap of the mahjong things as all the Chinese people, you know, mainly Chinese people playing mahjong all the way down for 2.5 days on the ship. Anyway, she told this anecdote about how she'd gone to get a ticket in Shanghai, and she was in a queue, and there was a European guy right in front of her, and they got chatting. His name turned out to be Vince, and when they got up to the counter, the Chinese lass behind the counter assumed that they were a couple, and oh no, they had to explain, no, they're not a couple, they're quite separate and so on. So they got the tickets. But anyway, when Jane got on board the ship, she found that indeed she had the cabin right next to Vince. And so she said, you know, they had a nice friendship, and they went down and had a nice cruise and described it all, and I thought, well, this sounds really romantic. This would be a great way for me to finish up my tour in China, because we're going to finish up in Shanghai. That's the end of the tour, so I can take this thing too. So that was good. So we got to Shanghai, and I had to stay for an extra 3 or 4 days because the rest of the people were American. They were going off back to America on the airplane, and I had to fill in another 3 or 4 days there, which I did. And I met this I'd gone on the Bund, which is this big broad walk along the river in Shanghai, to take some photographs, and there was this young man with a young child in his arms, and I thought, well, I'll just, I kind of indicated, can I take a photograph? Well, he kind of nodded, so I took the photograph. He came up to me and spoke in English. Turned out that he was teaching English 3 days a week in one of the factories there. And he befriended me, and of course I was a little wary at first, but he took me off to the Peace Park, where all the young people used to gather, and he introduced me to them all. They all asked me questions, because they were all studying English and so on. And then he took me off to his mother's home, which was a 2-room place. His mother was a doctor, and they were in a 2-room place. His father had been sent off to the western parts of China at the time of the Cultural Revolution, and very interesting. And he had a brother. I didn't meet the brother, but anyway, he showed me around for 3 days. Took me to places in Shanghai that most people wouldn't get to see. And of course, so I'm skipping ahead a little now. When I got back, I kept in touch with him by letter, and his English was good enough that I could understand what he was saying. And turned out that his brother was coming to Australia to study English, so they were both called Chow, but I distinguished them. It was Shanghai Chow, and then when his brother came to Sydney, this was Sydney Chow. And of course, when his brother came, I had to meet him at the airport and put him up and all the rest of it. And I remember the very first day that Sydney Chow had arrived, the very next day I was due to go on a little sail with this friend Jim Young that I mentioned earlier. Jim Young was a very keen sailor and had built a couple of his own yachts and so on, sailing on the harbour. So it had been arranged weeks before that we were going to go with Jim and have a sail on the harbour, you see. So of course Chow had to come too, because we couldn't leave him at home. We were looking after him. So as we sailed across the harbour to Vaucluse, we pointed out to Chow. He said, "Chow, Chow." And we pointed to all the homes. They said, "Workers' homes, workers' homes." I said, "No, only kidding." So that was fun. But anyway, what was I going to say? Oh, so anyway, after my 3 or 4 days in Shanghai on my own were finished and I was ready to go, I'd gotten my ticket to go on this same boat that Jane Morse had gone on. And I went down to the wharf where the boat was, and there were not many people there at all, but there was a European-looking fellow there, and I sat down next to him and we got chatting, and I said, "Well, my name's Ian." And he said, "My name's Vince." I said, "You're not the Vince that went with Jane Morse?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Don't tell me she published that." I reached into my pocket and I pulled out the article. Same guy. He was working for HUD, Housing and Urban Development, which is an American thing that were helping the Chinese with some of their housing problems. And his main office was in Hong Kong, so he was again on his way. He travelled around quite a bit, and as it turned out, my room was right next to his. My cabin was right next to his. We talked and ate and everything together. And as we approached Hong Kong, like the day before, he said, "Whereabouts you staying in Hong Kong?" I said, it was on one of the islands there." He said, "Oh, that'll be terrible." He said, the ferry only calls in there twice a day or something, and you'll be really restricted." He said, "Why don't you come and stay in the hotel where I am in Kowloon?" So I said, "All right." So I didn't bother to tell the other hotel. I just got off, met with him. And the very first night we were there, his Chinese colleagues in the office we were said, "Oh, we're taking you to dinner." So they took us off to a wonderful Chinese thing, and all the waiters had white gloves up to the elbow, and they gave us Peking duck and the whole thing. So, these were some of the adventures that I had. That was great.
What would you say called you back to Australia? And then you have to tell us a little bit about Monica, because that's a whole new life.
Yes, all right. Well,
What called you back to Australia?
what called me back?
Yeah,
Well, I
did you
intended
feel?
to come back all along, but the relationship with Vicky was coming to an end, and that was dissolving. And in fact, I came back to Australia for just a few weeks. At the beginning of 1985, I wanted to be back for my father's birthday, which was on the 1st of March. And the court case for the dissolving of the marriage was happening at that time. And it had been agreed that, I mean, I had no, there was no problem with it. Vicky decided she wanted all the photographs from our travels, and I was to keep the notes. That was the only thing we had to really decide, So on the morning of the day that the court case was, with me absent, which was arranged with the various solicitors or whatever, I called her, and we had a nice chat, and she said, yes, the case went fine, no problem, it's all done, we're now divorced. I just took off my wedding ring, and that was it. That was as far as my marriage to Vicky was concerned. And then that was the end of 1985. So that was early 1985 that happened. And I went back, and after I'd been back at work about maybe 4 or 5 months, the organisation I was working for had a major shake-up. They had all kinds of financial problems, and they laid off a number of staff, including me, as a staff that they could get by without. So I was out of work, and that made me more determined to go back to Australia. Well, this is the time to go back, and that's what I did. And then in those days they had what were they called? They had magazines in which you could advertise that you were interested to meet other people. That was before the internet, of course. And there was an advertisement in one of these from an Indian woman saying, she wanted to meet appropriate men, blah, blah, blah. So I wrote a nice little letter saying whatever I said, diplomatically worded as usual. And I subsequently later found out that this was Vicky, of course, not Vicky, I'm sorry, Monica, and that she and her brother, who was living in Sydney at the time, had gotten the 60-odd letters that had been in response to this advertisement, and they'd gotten rid of all the ones they thought wouldn't do, and I was in the 6th that was left. And then Monica used to tell the story that she thought what she would do was to see whether these potential suitors cared for Indian food or not. Spicy Indian food, you see. And I guess, without going into any further detail, I came out on top because I genuinely did like Indian food. And it was a little bit of a stormy getting together. I mean, she was getting out of her second marriage to a Hindu surgeon that wasn't a very happy marriage. She'd been married, I think, can't remember now, just 12 years or something. Anyway, it wasn't working out. And she had the two boys who were only just about pubescent. The eldest one was pubescent, the other one 2 or 3 years younger. And so over time it all worked out.
Did the boy stay with you?
No, that was the difficult thing for Monica. She didn't have any difficulty about parting from her second husband, but there was a very protracted and unpleasant and unfortunate custody battle, which the father got custody of the two boys, in Monica's view, as a result of a lot of manipulation and so forth. And as soon as he had custody, he sent them over to India to do their education, in Monica's view, to keep them away from her in order to punish her. But you know, she subsequently got back in touch with them. Anyway, that's all another story. Yeah, so there you are.
And you opened up more and more to Indian culture. And
Yeah, that's right.
history.
Well, I'd had two times in India even prior to meeting Monica. Those were other adventures, stories for another time. Yeah, but my visits to India with Monica were special because, of course, she knew her way around, spoke the language and spoke Hindi and so on. And it was a whole different experience, really. So there you are. So anything else you
No,
want?
you wanted to hear this question of what is it called?
The year that made you.
The
Sorry?
year
The
that
year that
made
made
you.
you.
That's what they always ask them on
Yeah, I don't know.
the Sager interviews on ABC Radio
I don't know,
National.
I suppose the year that I married Monica, probably.
Ah.
I,
And that was
the story there is that, you know, Jeff Cook comes from Wagga Wagga, and Monica and I were very friendly with Jeff, so I'd known Jeff for many years. And we went down to stay at his place at Wagga Wagga for one weekend. His parents' place, that is, his mother's place. His father had died early. But there's a place out of Wagga Wagga called The Rock, which is a big kind of hill. It's not really a mountain, it's a big hill.
Big rock.
Right? Yeah, it's called The Rock. And it's possible to climb up it using just a kind of a goat track up. And Monica at that time was suffering from asthma. But anyway, she had to go at this. We went up this thing and she managed to get to the top. And I felt quite proud of her for doing that, and I told her so. And it was in that context, Jeff very discreetly knew what was going to happen, so he discreetly went off down the track, out of earshot, and I proposed to Monica, you see. And all she did at that time was go, kind of giggled. So we let it go at that, but some months later I proposed again. And we did, yeah.
That was 87 or 80?
That was we got married on the 10th of December 1988.
Yeah.
Oh, right, in the bicentennial year.
And I think I've told you the story.
Bicentennial year.
Yeah, and the story was that when I proposed to her, it was probably October, and we realised that it was a bit of an awkward time to have a marriage and wedding celebration and so on, because we needed to give people some notice, enough notice of it. But on the other hand, we didn't want to get into December when everybody had Christmas things happening and so on. And then Monica suddenly had a bright idea. She said, well, look, on the 10th of December, I'm giving a big Christmas party, and I've invited lots of the Indian friends and so on from the Indian community. And she said, all we need to do is invite a few more people, appropriate people, and we won't tell them. So we engaged a marriage celebrant woman, and we had this, and we had a certain, not too far into the party when everybody was there, we hushed everybody. We said we have an announcement to make, and of course a lot of people nodded wisely. They knew what they thought was going to happen. So I announced our engagement and had the engagement ring and so on. And then they were all ready to, that and all ready to start talking again. I said, no, don't talk yet. I said, there's something else I want to introduce this lady. And I introduced her by name. And she then stood in front of Monica and me and went straight into the wedding thing. And so we were engaged for just a minute or so. At most.
Right. Yeah.
So that was the year that made it. Monica always claimed that she found a hippie. She found this hippie man that she then got on the straight and narrow.
Interesting.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for everybody for coming today.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And thank you
It
for
was
the
lovely.
wonderful hosts here.
Anytime,
Both of
no
you,
problem.
Jan and Claudio.
We do 85s.
We do 85.
And I want to thank Jan and Claudio in particular for hosting us. It was really sweet of you to do
It's
that.
very nice. It was
Fantastic.
lovely. Anytime you're going in the Highlands, pop in.
Yeah, no worries.
And flowers.
We're happy to have you.